Hola, comrades! Today's topic of interest, Super Smash Bros. Now, this is a strange idea for a game, and an even stranger idea for a franchise. True, you could say that about most anything Nintendo has invented. You have a plumber fighting a giant turtle to save a princess. You have a pink puffball gaining powers by swallowing anything in their path. You get the point. I've talked enough about how peculiar many of Nintendo's franchises are, but this is different. Super Smash Bros. Is not the first game that fulfilled the fantasies of 10 million little kids who wanted to see their favorite characters fight. Not long before this game was released, there was X-Men vs. Street Fighter, the first entry in the Marvel vs. Capcom series that remains popular to this day. However, this was the first such game to feature only characters that came from the medium of video games itself. These characters had won their way into the hearts of gamers for over a decade, so seeing them fight in a game like this was a dream come true. That these characters alone could carry a crossover game to great success was the sign of the cultural importance that not only these characters, but the art form as a whole was attaining. But that's not what made Smash Bros. Stand out among other fighting games. It wasn't about depleting your opponent's health bar down to nothing. The game was called Smash Bros. For a reason. The more damage you inflicted on your opponent, the easier it became to knock them out. And I mean that quite literally. You knocked them out of the arena. They could try to recover, but if they got knocked out too far out of the bounds of the arena, it was curtains for them. But if you were playing on a timed mode, the other player would respawn and have a chance to exact revenge on you. And so it went until the time ran out. If you knocked the other player out more than they knocked you out, then you won. Otherwise, you lost. Either way, you played another game because it was addicting. Maybe you chose a different stage. This was honestly not any more cartoonish than the Tarantino-esque ultra-violence of Mortal Kombat. But it was unique. It proved you could make an interesting fighting game without having to conform to the standards of what a fighting game was expected to be. There weren't any elaborate series of button presses that you had to master. Instead, the key to success was precision. And this formula succeeded. The first game was a hit, and Melee was even bigger, maintaining a community of players to this day. Brawl was more divisive, but though it angered the hardcore Melee fandom, it was a major step forward for the series and remains its best entry. Smash 4 didn't quite capture Brawl's magic, but was a solid game on its own right. Nintendo has through the years understood that the key to grafting a great fantasy series has much to do with creating a believable internal logic. It does not matter that the series does not conform to what we consider sensible. It matters that the series takes itself seriously and expands upon its central ideas. That holds true here. After enough matches, the idea of winning at a fighting game by knocking opponents out of an arena is not gimmicky. It's natural. It makes a certain sort of weird sense. The game sets up its own rules, and it does not break them. If there was no internal consistency, people would have abandoned the series quickly. If, between matches, the amount of knockback generated by slamming Bowser with a home run bat when he's at 66% damage changed, the player would be unable to escape the conclusion that luck was vastly more important than skill. So there was no point to practicing one's skills. There was no point to playing the game over and over again and learning all its little intricacies. This is the greatest flaw in the Mario Party series, for the record, and it is one that the franchise was never able to fix. It was too focused on promoting wacky hijinks and keeping games interesting to the end to focus on skill, and because of that, it never attained the same level of replayability as Smash. There was a skill component in the form of the mini-games, but most of the time spent playing Mario Party was spent traveling around the board, and that traveling around the board is heavily luck-based. There were so many luck-based events that strategy was never as important as it should have been. But there was enough consistency in Smash Bros. that the gameplay stopped seeming odd. Sure, if you stepped back and examined the games as an outsider, they seemed weird, but the mechanics are straightforward enough that you can move past the surreality, and there's enough depth that you can log hundreds or even thousands of hours into these games without becoming bored. Internal consistency goes a long way toward familiarizing the unknown, and in video games, the process is taken a step further by mechanical rote repetition. Sending animals with magic powers that you've captured in little red balls to fight other magic animals that other people have captured in little red balls so that you can win cash and prizes may seem odd at first, but after enough Pokémon battles, you will discern that the same input will always lead to the same output under the same conditions. A ground attack on a flying enemy will always miss unless a move like gravity is used, for example. From there, you can figure out the world, and it stops seeming so utterly bizarre. This is an advantage that games have over other methods of storytelling. They can indulge in more bizarre and surreal scenarios without confusing the audience. Gravity can be reversed, and islands can float in the air, but if the controls are the same, then you still have an inroads to comprehension, and you can attempt to familiarize yourself with the new surroundings. This is different than books, where what words a writer uses can reveal some aspects of the surroundings while obscuring others, or like film, where dream logic roams free and wild, and where even a normal, everyday scene can be made to seem unusual and discordant. In gaming, however, an area looks and behaves like it does because it was programmed with specific parameters. There's a simple logic to it that can be understood. Even an unusual object, like a floating island, can be observed from different angles and distances until it loses that mystique, whereas in film, the mystery could be amplified with certain choices of cinematography and editing, and in novels only certain aspects of the islands would be emphasized so that it was described less like an actual, tangible object and more like a representative symbol. Of course, that does not mean that inconceivable, arcane surreality cannot be used in gaming. It's more difficult, yes, but it's possible. Expectations need to be subverted for it to work, though. A region can't only look bizarre, it must act bizarre. For example, if a player has been able to open treasure chests to collect gold throughout the game, have the same number of treasure chests in the surreal area, but have them contain nothing. Then have the final room of that area be made out of treasure chests, or have the final boss be a treasure chest. Obfuscate. Subvert. Be creative in a manipulative way. Take the established mechanics and twist them. Life is Strange does this extremely well in Max's nightmare sequence. But unless one goes out of their way to subvert expectation, even the most MC Escher-like landscape can be made understandable by the action of the player playing through it. This gives game developers more license to be creative and expressionistic with their designs. There's no reason for them to conform to realism. It's no more difficult to create an imaginative alien landscape like Urea in Xenoblade Chronicles 2 than it is to invent the next boring brown-tinted desert. Super Smash Bros. Understands this. It knows that it can introduce an over-the-top game dynamic like the final Smash, and to not surrender to pure camp because it integrates it as a restrained, modulated mechanic. It's fun to use, but it's not all-powerful, so it doesn't take over the game, but rather adds to the chaos. In the same vein, the series can feature arenas in ancient castles and lava pits and pirates' ships, and platforms floating out in the middle of interstellar space, and to not confuse the gamers, because while the levels do play differently from one another, and some levels have gimmicks, and others transform, the mechanics do not change. The blind push toward realism was a grave mistake. It's time to admit that now. It was a forgivable mistake, and some good did come out of it. Gaming wanted to be taken seriously, and so it blindly copied its impression of what made film work in an attempt to be considered cinematic and mature. But while series like Uncharted and BioShock told nuanced, complex, thematically dense stories with memorable, layered, rounded characters, enlarged the push toward realism changed gaming more than it forced it to mature. In the last 10 years, there has been no shortage of cliché games about angst-ridden, muscle-bound dudes. Games that pretend to know something of the suffering and tragedy at the heart of human existence, but instead makes empty, soulless proclamations in an attempt to justify their insipid cynicism and banality. It's so pretentious. But gaming can break free from these chains. It is in a unique position to broach the topic of the surreal and the unusual, and I believe this is possible. We have entered a new era in gaming, one where exploration is more integrated with the gaming experience than ever before. I implore game designers to build off the success of games like Super Mario Odyssey and Breath of the Wild in order to tap into the more illogical and the more expressionistic. They should not worry about losing their audience. As long as the gameplay is intuitive, they need not worry. Smash Bros. Is a remarkable franchise because it fully admits that it's silly, but it doesn't care. It's not ashamed of it. This is a game in which characters that have no cause to interact fight one another. And if they're knocked out of the arena, they respawn shortly. It's a frenzy of activity. And it does not take itself too seriously. That does not stop it from being an exhilarating gameplay experience, though. Why would it? These games are a thrill to play. They're designed from the viewpoint of a child making their action figures fight, but that does not mean they have to deliver content that would only please a child. The level of care Nintendo puts into every minor aspect of their franchises is palpable. This franchise has stopped seeming like a crossover and started existing as its own entity, and that this has occurred demonstrates how solid and unique these games are. Nothing has been ignored, nothing has been overlooked. The player is encouraged to explore these games and discover every last secret that they have to offer. Of course, to be fair, one of the reasons why this has begun seeming like a franchise is that it's the only time some older, retired Nintendo characters are brought into the modern gaming landscape. There's an entire generation of gamers out there who have no idea that Captain Falcon had his own line of games. Seriously, Nintendo, make more F-Zero games. And in line with the topic of this video, make them wild and postmodern and ethereal. It's a strategy that would fit this series perfectly, actually. So anyway, if you liked what you saw today, consider donating to my Patreon so I can produce even more unusual content. Also, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that unearthly stuff. Adios, comrades!